History is more than dates and battles. It is the story of ordinary people living through extraordinary change. In this episode of the African Archive, we journey to medieval West Africa, where the kingdoms of Mandé stood on the edge of a new chapter in history. Through historical evidence and the rich oral traditions preserved by generations of griots, we'll explore how the Mali Empire was born, not as a legend, but as a story lived by real people. This is the birth of the Mali Empire. Chapter 1. When the balance began to shift. For many years, life in Mandé followed familiar patterns. The seasons returned, markets opened and closed. Caravans continued their long journeys across the Sahara, carrying news as surely as they carried salt and cloth. But beyond the villages, the balance of power was changing. The old Ghana Empire, which had once dominated much of the region's trade, had declined. In its place, smaller kingdoms competed for influence. Some formed alliances. Others fought to protect their land or expand it. No single ruler commanded all of Mandé. For ordinary people, these struggles were often felt before they were understood. A trading route that had always been safe could become uncertain. A journey that once took weeks might be delayed by conflict. A village might receive fewer visitors than it had the season before. News arrived in fragments, carried by merchants, travelers, and griots moving from one community to another. Among the kingdoms rising during this period was Sosso, ruled by Sosso Kingdom. Much of what is said about Sosso comes from oral tradition, where he is remembered as a powerful and feared ruler. Historians agree that his kingdom expanded across parts of the region, though many details of his reign remain uncertain. What is clearer is that the growing influence of Sosso changed the political landscape of Mandé. Some rulers accepted its power. Others resisted. Alliances that had lasted for years were tested. Communities found themselves living in a region where old relationships no longer offered the same certainty. Even so, daily life continued. Fields still needed tending. Children still learned the skills of their families. Hunters entered the forest. Blacksmiths worked beside their furnaces. Griots continued to preserve the memories of earlier generations, reminding their audiences that times of change had come before. History rarely changes everything at once. It gathers slowly, like clouds before the first rain. Across Mandé, small changes were beginning to touch many lives. On their own, each seemed ordinary. Together, they marked the beginning of a new chapter in the region's history. In time, these changes would draw scattered kingdoms toward a single struggle, one that would reshape West Africa for generations to come. Chapter 2. The land grows uneasy. Change did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, carried by the people who traveled the roads between kingdoms. Traders returned from distant markets with stories they had heard along the way. Hunters spoke of unfamiliar warriors seen near old paths. Griots added new names to the stories they carried from one village to the next. At first, these were only fragments of news. No one village could see the whole picture. Across Mandé, independent rulers governed their own lands. Some were linked by family ties. Others traded with one another or settled disputes through negotiation. But there was no single authority over them all. Each kingdom looked first to its own survival. Beyond Mandé, another kingdom was growing stronger. The Sosso Kingdom, under the rule of Sosso Kingdom, expanded its influence across the region. Oral traditions remember Sosso as a powerful ruler whose name inspired fear. While those traditions include legendary elements, historians agree that Sosso became a major political force during the early 13th century. Its rise changed more than the map. Communities that had long managed their own affairs found themselves living in a region where power was becoming more concentrated. Some rulers chose to submit. Others resisted. Old alliances weakened as new ones were formed. For ordinary people, these changes were often measured in small ways. A familiar trading route became less certain. A market welcomed fewer visitors than before. Travelers arrived with greater caution, bringing news of disputes beyond the horizon. Life, however, did not stop. The fields still had to be planted before the rains. Livestock still needed care. Families still gathered each evening to share meals and listen as the griots recalled the histories of their people. The routines that had shaped life for generations continued, even as the world around them slowly shifted. History often moves this way. Long before a single battle changes the course of a region, quieter changes begin to reshape everyday life. They are easy to overlook at the time. Only later do they appear as the first signs of something larger. Across Mandé, those signs were becoming harder to ignore. The land had not yet become an empire. The man history would remember as Sundiata had not yet changed its future. But the conditions that would make such change possible were already taking shape. And before long, the story of Mandé would become the story of a people searching for unity in an uncertain age. Chapter 3. A people looking for unity. Across Mandé, uncertainty had become part of everyday life. The small kingdoms that shared the region had long governed themselves. Each had its own ruler, its own customs, and its own responsibilities. They traded with one another, married across families, and sometimes settled disputes through negotiation. At other times, they fought. As the power of Sosso grew, these local rivalries became more difficult to manage. A kingdom that stood alone could easily become vulnerable. Leaders who had once focused on their nearest neighbors now faced a much larger challenge. The question was no longer simply how to protect one village or one town. It was how to protect the future of Mandé itself. News continued to spread along the trade routes. Merchants carried more than goods. They carried reports of changing alliances, new demands for tribute, and rulers seeking support from their neighbors. Griots preserved these events in memory, linking each new development to stories that had been told for generations. The people who worked the land could not escape these changes. Trade affected the markets where they bought and sold their goods. Conflict made some journeys less certain than before. Families watched as the world beyond their communities became increasingly unsettled. Even while the work of planting, harvesting, and raising children continued. It was during this period that oral tradition introduces one of the most important figures in West African history. Sundiata Keita. The story of Sundiata has been preserved for centuries by griots. Their accounts describe his family, his years of exile, and his eventual return. These traditions remain central to the history of Mandé, though historians continue to distinguish between details supported by multiple sources and those that belong to the epic tradition. What is not in dispute is Sundiata's place in history. By the early 13th century, he had emerged as the leader of a growing coalition of Mandé rulers. Communities that had once acted independently began to unite around a common purpose. Their goal was not simply to win a battle. It was to restore stability to a region that had lived with increasing uncertainty. Unity did not erase differences. The kingdoms that joined this alliance brought their own traditions, leaders, and interests. Holding them together required more than military strength. It required trust, cooperation, and a shared belief that their future was stronger together than apart. The path ahead would test that belief. Soon, the struggle for Mandé would reach a turning point remembered for centuries in both history and oral tradition. The outcome would shape far more than the fate of a single kingdom. It would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the history of West Africa. Chapter 4. The battle that changed Mandé. By the early 13th century, the future of Mandé rested on a single question. Could the kingdoms remain divided, or would they stand together? For years, power in the region had shifted as the Sosso Kingdom expanded its influence. Some rulers accepted that new reality. Others chose to resist. What had begun as a series of local struggles had become a conflict that reached across much of Mandé. Sundiata Keita emerged as the leader of a growing alliance of Mandé rulers. Although the details of his early life are preserved mainly through oral tradition, historians agree that he played a central role in bringing together kingdoms that had once acted independently. That alliance faced its greatest test at the Battle of Keita. The exact date of the battle is still debated, and many details come from the epic of Sundiata rather than contemporary written records. Even so, historians broadly agree that the battle marked a decisive turning point in the history of West Africa. For the people of Mandé, its outcome reached far beyond the battlefield. A victory would mean the possibility of greater security along trade routes, stronger ties between neighboring kingdoms, and the chance to rebuild after years of political uncertainty. A defeat would have carried very different consequences. The alliance prevailed. Soumaro Kante and the power of the Sosso Kingdom were broken. The kingdoms that had joined together under Sundiata's leadership had achieved more than a military victory. They had created the conditions for a new political order. Yet battles do not end a story. When the fighting stops, people return to fields that still need planting. Traders prepare for journeys that cannot wait. Families mourn those who do not return, while others begin rebuilding what conflict has disrupted. History often remembers the day a battle was won. The people who lived through it remembered everything that came after. The victory at Keita did not create the Mali Empire in a single moment. Instead, it opened the door to something that had never existed before. A united Mandé with the possibility of lasting peace and shared leadership. What followed would determine whether that possibility could become reality. The work of winning a kingdom had ended. The harder work of building an empire was about to begin. Chapter 5. Building an Empire. The victory at the Battle of Keita marked the end of one struggle. It also marked the beginning of another. Winning a battle is one thing. Building a lasting peace is another. Across Mandé, people began returning to the routines that had been interrupted by years of conflict. Farmers prepared their fields for another season. Traders reopened routes that had become uncertain. Villages welcomed travelers once more, carrying goods, news, and ideas between distant communities. These small signs of normal life mattered. They showed that stability was beginning to return. Under the leadership of Sundiata Keita, the alliance that had defeated Sosso did not simply dissolve after the fighting ended. Instead, it became the foundation of a new political order. Kingdoms that had once stood apart were now connected through shared leadership, mutual obligations, and a common interest in maintaining peace. According to Mandé oral tradition, leaders gathered after the victory to establish principles for governing the new state. Many historians connect these traditions with what is known today as the Kurukan Fuga, a charter remembered for setting out rules concerning governance, social organization, and responsibilities within the emerging empire. While the exact form and date of the charter remains subject of scholarly debate, it reflects an enduring memory that the new empire sought order as well as power. As stability grew, trade expanded. Merchants traveled more confidently along routes linking the forests of West Africa to the edge of the Sahara. Gold moved north. Salt moved south. Markets grew busier as goods passed from one community to another. The wealth of Mali did not come from gold alone. It came from people who farmed the land, raised livestock, forged iron, crafted tools, carried goods across long distances, and kept trade moving from one season to the next. Their work gave strength to an empire that was still taking shape. The empire also became a meeting place for different traditions. Indigenous spiritual practices remained an important part of daily life across many communities. Islam, already established among many merchants and scholars, continued to spread through trade and learning. Together, these traditions became part of the rich and varied society that developed within Mali. The empire that emerged was larger than any one ruler. It depended on local leaders, merchants, artisans, griots, farmers, and families whose daily efforts held its many parts together. Long after the battles had ended, they continued the work of building a society that could endure. In time, the influence of Mali would reach far beyond Mandé. Its rulers would become known across Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Its cities would grow into centers of trade and learning. Its wealth would become the subject of stories told far from the lands where it began. But every empire has a beginning. For Mali, that beginning was not only a victory in battle. It was the patient work of people rebuilding their lives, season after season, until a new future took root across the land. Chapter 6. What remained? Empires are often remembered for their size. They are measured by the lands they ruled, the wealth they gathered, or the armies they commanded. But those things are only part of the story. Long before the world came to know the name Mali, its people had already begun shaping the foundations of an empire through their work, their traditions, and their determination to rebuild after years of uncertainty. The empire that grew from Mandé would become one of the greatest powers of the medieval world. Its trade routes stretched across the Sahara. Its gold reached distant markets. Its cities welcomed merchants, scholars, and travelers from many lands. In the generations that followed, rulers such as Mansour Musa would bring Mali to the attention of the wider world, while centers of learning such as Timbuktu became known for scholarship, trade, and the exchange of ideas. Yet the story of Mali did not begin with its greatest fame. It began much earlier. It began in villages where families followed the seasons. It began along trade routes worn smooth by countless journeys. It began in communities that learned to live with change before they understood where that change would lead. Much about the early history of Mali remains uncertain. Historians continue to compare oral traditions, archaeological discoveries, and written accounts to better understand how the empire emerged. Some questions may never be answered with complete certainty. Rather than weaken the story, those uncertainties remind us that history is often a conversation between memory and evidence. What remains beyond debate is the empire's lasting influence. The political traditions established in Mandé shaped generations of rulers. The networks of trade connected distant regions for centuries. The cultural heritage preserved by griots carried the memory of the empire long after its political power declined. Today, that memory still lives. Not only in written histories, not only in archaeological discoveries, but also in the stories passed from one generation to the next, reminding us that the past survives because people choose to remember it. The rise of the Mali Empire was not the story of a single battle. It was not the story of one remarkable leader alone. It was the story of a people whose everyday lives became part of something far greater than themselves. And perhaps that is the lesson history leaves behind. Great civilizations are not built in a single moment. They are built over many seasons, by ordinary people whose names are often forgotten, but whose lives make extraordinary history possible. Thanks for staying with us this far. If this story matters to you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the next chapter of Africa's remarkable past. The archive is never closed. We'll see you in the next story.